This is the Aputure 120D Mark II, a really popular light for filmmaking because it's lightweight, really powerful and really versatile. This is the Pixapro LED100D Mark III, a light that claims to be brighter, it's bi-colour and it's a lot cheaper. So does it hold up to the claims? I bought this with my own money, this isn't a sponsored video, I'm not affiliated with Pixapro in any way, so I just thought I'd give it a shot, compare it to my Aputure light, see how it is, see if it kind of stands up to the claims. So first of all, build quality. This feels like a nicely put together light. It's pretty solid, aluminium housing. It's a nice body. There are a few differences from the Aputure light. This has got 2 screws, one on each side here. The Aputure has just got the one yoke here on this side, which I find a little bit more convenient just because when you're adjusting it, you only have to do one side. Whereas obviously for this one, you need to loosen off both, move it, tighten it up again. The other thing I'm not a huge fan with the yoke is that it's kind of stepped, so you can see it sort of goes in steps like that. And they're quite small steps, but they are stepped nonetheless. So if you want to have really kind of fine adjustment of the light, that's a little bit annoying. The Aputure, on the other hand, is just completely smooth. So it just, it's completely adjustable, stepless like that, which is nice. One thing I don't like about my Aputure though, is the Bowen S-mount fitting is really loose. So when you put softboxes, reflectors on, they kind of flap about a bit, which is a bit annoying. With the Pixapro, it's much more solid. There's not that same give, that same wiggle. It's really nice. It's really nicely put together. In terms of dimensions, they're pretty much identical. This is then without the reflectors on, so they're about the same length, about 300mm. They're also about the same width and height as well. Strangely enough, on the Pixapro website, it's listed as bigger than it is. It was, let me just check, on the website they had it listed as 300 by 251 by 170. And I made it 300 by 200, so 5 centimeters less wide, by 130, so 4 centimeters less deep. So it is actually smaller than it says. It's basically exactly the same dimensions as the Aputure light. Now I did weigh the lights as well. I'm just going to have to read it off my phone here. The Aputure head only is 2,108 grams. So if you had that up on a stand, that's what's on top of your stand, 2,108. The Pixapro is 2,186. So it's pretty much the same, 80 grams difference. You're not going to notice much of that. One difference is that the Pixapro is much more self-contained. The Aputure has the control box, which doubles up as the VMount connector. It's then got the cables running in and out of that. So the total weight of everything for the Aputure, including the control box and the cables, is 4,193, whereas the total weight for everything for the Pixapro, so that's the light head and the AC power adapter, is 2,882. So that's about 1,300 grams lighter, 1.3 kilos lighter for the whole thing for the Pixapro, which is nice. That doesn't include the V-mount plate, because the V-mount plate is separate on the Pixapro. You have a separate standard power adapter and V-mount. So if you had them both in V-mount mode, the Aputure light would come up as 3,673, a little bit lighter because it doesn't have the mains power cable. So 3,673 for the Aputure, and it would be 2,481 for the Pixapro. So we're talking, what's that, about 1.2 kilos lighter when you're running them in V-mount mode. Bearing in mind you've then got to add V-lock batteries to that. All this means that what's really on top of your stand is going to be about the same weight, give or take. What's in your bag is potentially going to be a bit lighter using the Pixapro than it is with the Aputure light, which is nice. One really simple physical feature of the Pixapro that I really like, that I wish the Aputure had actually, is just this, so simple, but it's this little umbrella holder. Just to poke the shaft of an umbrella through here, gives you a really nice way of creating a soft light. If you're kind of running and gunning, or you're traveling light for whatever reason, that means you only need to take a little pop-up umbrella rather than a big softbox. And by way of comparison, this is a 90 centimeter softbox folded up, and it's a fairly chunky unit compared to, this is a 43-inch umbrella, fits in there and weighs nothing. So for traveling light, it's really nice to have that umbrella holder. I do wish the Aputure had that. I've always been really impressed by how quiet the fan in the Aputure light is. But I've got to say, the Pixapro is actually even quieter. The Mark II of this light, so this is the Mark III, the Mark II of this light was too noisy. I bought one, I sent it back because it was too noisy. The Mark III is really quiet, and it's noticeably quieter than the Aputure. One thing I really don't like about the Pixapro light is this reflector that it comes with, the standard reflector. So inside this reflector, it's kind of a mixture of just gloss, kind of smooth silver, and this sort of stippled effect, and then back to gloss again at the end, which when you shine it at a flat surface just gives you these kind of concentric rings and just looks horrible. You don't get a nice smooth light. They do package it with this diffuser that kind of snaps onto the end, which does sort it out, but if you're using just a reflector, you're probably looking for hard light and you don't necessarily want to be diffusing it. So it's not great. I'd love to see them update the design of this reflector so that it's just stippled the whole way through. The Aputure one, by comparison, is like that. It's just kind of stippled, that stippled effect the whole way. You can pop this on the Pixapro Lite and it solves that concentric ring effect. So they just need a better reflector on the Pixapro. Now, a huge benefit of the Pixapro product is the price, let's be honest. So this, just for the light, is £350. The Aputure light will set you back $766, I looked today on CVP's website. So over twice the price, but the Aputure light does come with basically all the accessories that you need. The Pixapro product, when you buy it, that £350 will just get you the light, basically. If you want to add on those products, those do cost extra. I bought mine at essentialphoto.com. Again, I'm not affiliated with them in any way, it's just where I bought it, and I think they are the sole importer for the UK of these products. When buying from those, you can get all of those accessories reduced, and so for equivalent package that basically comes with the remote control, comes with the VMount plate, comes with a bag, it'll set you back £450. I chose not to get the bag because I just didn't need it, and this is kind of the nice thing about having the ability to buy those things separately. If you know you don't need a remote, if you know you don't need a V-lock battery, if you know you don't need a bag, you don't have to buy them, whereas with the Aputure, it just all comes as part of the kit. So you can just spend 350 quid, get the light, or you can spend a little bit more and get all those other products. So yeah, for me, it was the light, I got the VMount plate, and I got the remote control, which actually comes as a dongle and as the remote itself. And that came to 400, which is still a lot cheaper than the 766 that the Aputure light is. The remote controls themselves are quite different. This is the Aputure one, and this is the Pixapro one. I prefer the layout of the Aputure one. It's just a little bit simpler. You can clearly see each one of your channels, each one of your groups. It's easier to switch. This is a little bit more not counterintuitive, unintuitive, should we say. But fundamentally it does work. One thing I really dislike about both of these remote controls is this. This is the Pixapro. And the Aputure, not quite as bad, but they're both really clicky. So you press the buttons and you hear a really loud audible click as you try and change it. So say if you're in the middle of an interview setting, say the sun starts to come up a bit from the windows outside, and you want to close down your Aputure and bump the lights up a little bit, you're going to have to click, 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 and your sound engineer is going to go nuts at you because you're clicking away through the middle of a take. The Aputure is kind of similar, but it is definitely quieter. They could both improve in this regard, but this one's a lot worse. They need to make a remote that doesn't click quite so loudly every time you press the button. One thing I do like about the Pixapro remote is that it does actually show you on screen what your power level is. If you can't see the light, you can still see that it's at 40, 41, 42, whatever percent. With the Aputure, you don't have a screen at all, so unless you can actually see the controller box of the light and see what power it's at, you're just kind of flying blind. So I do like the fact that you can see it with this. As another little tiny feature, this Pixapro one has also got a little cold shield on the bottom, which is quite nice because I tend to find that I leave this round set everywhere and then have to ask the talent where I've left my remote. The V-mount plates themselves are quite different. So this is the one on the Aputure that you might be familiar with. It's pretty big. Battery goes on the back here. It also acts as the controller. You can change groups and that kind of stuff on here, which is nice. But it is quite a big old unit. For the Pixapro, it's much simpler, literally just this little thing. It doesn't have any buttons on it, it doesn't do anything like that. It's literally just slot a battery on. It's got these Velcro straps to strap it to a light stand. Does the job, nice and lightweight, no problems. Now, of course, one of the main features of the Pixapro is that it is a bi-colour light. The Aputure is only daylight, it's 5500 Kelvin. This does range from, meant to be 5500 to 3200, so that goes from pure white down to, that's sort of 3200 there. You probably can't see a huge difference on this, but it does anyway. This is a really nice feature to have, particularly in a pinch, because it is quite hard often to gel these big lights, particularly if they're in a softbox. It's fair enough just to whack a bit of gel on the end of a reflector, but if you've got the Aputure light in a big softbox, then the only way really to gel it, I've found, is to cut out, say if I'm in an octabox, I have to cut out an octagon of CTO gel, say, and stick it kind of halfway into the softbox, because if you were actually to stick it straight over the chip, you probably just burn a hole in it. The Aputure 120D Mark II goes down to 1% power setting, whereas the Pixapro light only goes down to 10%. This is actually a little bit more of an issue than it sounds like, and we'll discover why when we get into talking about the power settings later on. If you change the power settings on the back of the light itself, they'll change in 10% increments. You can only change in 1% increments if you're using the remote, so it's worth bearing that in mind. Also, slightly strangely, if you're using the remote and you're already set to 10%, if you go down, it will still show as going down to 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, whatever, but the actual light output will just be exactly the same as 10%. It doesn't actually go down any further. So it'd be nice if they just updated that just to show on the actual remote itself and on the light that it's not at 6%, it's just still at 10. So onto the juicy stuff, the power output. So the Pixapro light claims to be brighter than the Aputure. The Aputure says that it is 7,000 lux at 1 meter. The Pixapro claims to be 11,000 lux at 1 meter. So it should be, 50% brighter, which is a lot, especially considering it's 50% of the cost. I tested both lights in 10% power increments, so 100, 90, 80, 70, 60, all the way down to the minimum, which is 10% on the Pixapro and 1% on the Aputure, because it can go that bit lower. I pointed each light in turn at a colour chart. I set the zebras on my camera to 70% to make sure that a particular part of the colour chart was always at the same exposure as I changed the power on the lights. I then read off what the aperture, shutter speed and ISO were for the camera to get to that. That way I could see what camera settings I would need to get the same amount of illumination on the chart, thereby telling which light is more powerful and by how much. While I was at it, I also used the neutral grey part of the colour chart to take a white balance reading from, a custom white balance reading from, which would tell me the Kelvin and any green or magenta tint. For the Aputure, I obviously just tested it at the one colour temperature it's got, 5500. The Pixapro I tested at 5500 Kelvin, 4300 Kelvin and 3200 Kelvin. I'll post my full results on my website. I'll stick a link in the description and you can read through those at your leisure. I won't go through them all now because we'll be here till Christmas. But my big findings are, at full power for both lights with just a reflector, both lights came out identical in terms of power. But this did turn out to be because the Pixapro has a bit of a hot spot right in the centre, which was giving it a bit of an unfair advantage. When I stuck both lights in the same 90cm octobox, softbox, the Aputure at full blast was getting an extra stop over the Pixapro, so it was a stop brighter. What really surprised me was the minimum output of both of these lights. The Aputure goes down really, really low. That 1% actually worked out to be less, quite a lot less than 1% of its maximum brightness. The Pixapro, on the other hand, was nowhere near. So it does only go down to 10%, only reads 10% on the dial, but the 10% is not 10%. 10% actually worked out to be about 35-ish%. So it is only actually about a third the power of full blast. So really the actual amount of control you've got is, less than 2 stops. To put it another way, the 10% setting on the Pixapro, the minimum setting you can get, worked out as about the same as about 55% on the Aputure. So you wouldn't be able to turn the Pixapro down lower than the Aputure at about 55%. If you're just using this light for interviews, you've generally got it in a big softbox, something like that, and it's your key light, that's not going to be a huge problem. But if you're just trying to have like a little kind of kiss of rim light, kiss of rim doesn't sound right, does it? But if you are just trying to have kind of a little kiss of light, say a little backlight or something on a product, on a close-up, bear in mind that it is still a pretty bright light, even on minimum setting, as I say, equivalent to about 55% on the Aputure 120D Mark II. In terms of colour consistency, both lights were pretty consistent. I was pretty impressed with both. The Aputure was a little bit more consistent in terms of colour temperature, whereas the Pixapro got ever so slightly warmer as you turned the power down, but not so much that I'd really be worried about it. In terms of green magenta shift, both of them performed really well. There was very little shift in either light. When I tested the Pixapro light at different colour temperature settings, so when I tested it at 4300 and 3200, colour accuracy was pretty similar. Again, there was just a little bit of a shift as the power changed, but nothing that I'd be too alarmed by. The maximum power output did get a tiny bit lower the more orange the light went, if that makes sense. So the maximum output, 100% at 4300, was about a third of a stop less than it was at 55. And at 3200, it was about 2/3 of a stop less than it was at 55. There was one slightly weird setting I found, which was just kind of a bug in the Pixapro almost, which is if you're below 20% in power and you select specifically 5500 Kelvin, it's blue. Just 5500 Kelvin, not 5400, not 5600, those look fine, they look normal, just 5500 Kelvin comes out blue. I don't know why. It also loses about 2/3 of a stop of power. This literally just happens at less than 20% power and specifically at 5500. So it's not a huge issue, just go to 5600 or 5400. but it was kind of weird. As I say, I'll post the full results onto my website, so do check out the link in the description, and you can go through them at your leisure, and you can see all the little changes in colour and changes in brightness as I adjusted the power of each light. One problem that I did run into with the Pixapro light that I didn't find with the Aputure is flicker at really high shutter speeds. Practically speaking, I don't see this being a huge problem because it's only is at very high shutter speeds over sort of 500th of a second, maybe even a bit more than that, and it is worse at low power settings on the light. Generally speaking, if I'm filming over a 500th of a second, I'm probably needing that light and I've probably got it turned right up, in which case the flicker isn't so bad. I did notice that the flicker is worse at the two ends of the colour temperature spectrum, so at 5600 it's can get quite bad, at 3200 it can get quite bad, right in the middle, kind of 4300, it's pretty solid, it's much less flickery. I don't know why that is, maybe it's something they can work on. Yeah, in practical terms, I don't see it being a huge deal because generally speaking, I'm not filming at really high shutter speeds, but if you do want to use it for still photography, where you might be using high shutter speeds, or for, say, super slow motion work, bear that in mind, it could be an issue. In terms of the actual quality of the light, I think they both look really, really nice. They both report really high CRI numbers. I don't have a way of checking this, but just looking at the results kind of back to back, they look pretty similar to me. You can let me know in the comments if you see a big difference, but to me, they both look really nice. So, no, I'm afraid the Pixapro 100B Mark III isn't just a cheaper, brighter, bi-colour version of the Aputure 120D Mark II. It is, however, a nice light and it'd be really useful for the right person. Maybe that person's you, maybe it's not, but at least now, hopefully with this information, you can make your mind up on that one. So what do you think? Could this be useful for you, or do those shortcomings not really work with the way that you shoot? It'd be great to hear from you, so let me know in the comments below, and I'll catch you next time.